Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the international research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospect of Criticism. The project is conducted in collaboration with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of their Art Seeking Understanding program. In this seminar, recorded on the 21st of May 2026, Professor Pablo Tinio presents his work on the mirror model of aesthetic experience, according to which our experience of art typically involves a perceptual and cognitive structure which mirrors in reverse that of the artist's creative process. Professor Tinio argues that the psychology of aesthetics and the arts, one of the oldest areas of psychological research, has undergone a profound shift in recent decades, allowing researchers to move away from studying simple responses to low-level visual features and towards the study of the full complexity of our aesthetic experience of art.
Thank you everybody for joining us here today. Very nice to see you, and of course especially a warm welcome to our speaker, Pablo Tinio, who is a director of the Creativity and Aesthetics Lab and a professor at Montclair State University. Pablo has worked in many areas that are of great interest to us, and broadly the kind of psychology of aesthetics and creativity. And he is also the holder of another Templeton research project, rather like the one we've got. So, and this is, of course, one of the things you'll be talking about today. The name of the project is Mirror to the World, the Power of Art to Build Understanding and Creativity, which is based at Montclair State and also at the Yale School for Emotional Intelligence. And we're so looking forward to this talk, and I'll just pass the word to you now, Pablo.
All right, I'm muted. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm really quite honored. So I was very close to your university, Uppsala, last summer. I was in Stockholm, and for a moment I was like, I wonder if I just should drive there and say hi, but I did not. So the title of my talk is Art as a Mirror, Revealing the Hidden Layers of the Aesthetic Encounter. I'm just going to focus on that part there where it says hidden layers, because I will propose a model that allows us to uncover some of the layers of that art encounter, aesthetic encounter, art engagement, whatever we want to call it. I'll start with a brief background on my field, psychology of art and aesthetics, also known as empirical aesthetics. It's known as the second oldest field in psychology. Founded, well, actually, we attribute it to 1856, like the founding, with Gustav Theodor Fechner, G.T. Fechner. He was a psychophysicist, and then started doing work on how people sort of preference for different types of art, right? And it's been so long, like the field has been such a lot of history behind the field, and most of the emphasis in research throughout decades and decades and decades were really focused on basic visual features. It's something I did for my PhD. My dissertation supervisor, Helmut Lader, he focused his research on basic visual features as well. Things like symmetry, complexity in artworks, color, and how those impact aesthetic reactions. Another common sort of study is the comparing representational versus abstract art, or different styles of art, and how the styles themselves impact aesthetic reactions or aesthetic experience. So this has been the focus in terms of what we call, as psychologists and scientists, the independent variables. The dependent variables, those reactions that I talked about, the most common have been liking, preference, interest. How beautiful or attractive you find a painting, or some whatever stimulus it is. And today I'm going to focus on visual stimuli. So that's the focus of the field. Again, second oldest field in psychology. Despite this vast scholarship that we've collected, amassed over the years, we haven't really been successful at fully capturing the meaningful aesthetic experiences, right? So I don't know about you, like when I walk into a museum and I look at an artwork, right, or look at an exhibition, it's not always whether I like it or I don't, right? That's part of it, obviously. But there's other things that happen during that aesthetic encounter that can't be accounted for by whether I like it or I don't, whether it's attractive or not, beautiful or not. Actually, beauty is really one of those things that is talked about a lot in art, but when you actually talk to people, it's not one that they readily or easily talk about, right? If you just give them a sort of like, what do you think of this piece? That question, open question. Beauty is not always the one that they're going to talk about. But in writings, in our research, empirical aesthetics, that's something we've focused on through the decades of work that we've done. So I'm going to pause a bit and talk a little bit about the museum, because I'm going to present two sets of research that we've done in museums. And when we think about museums, there are a few things that museums provide, right? As far as supporting, scaffolding, whatever you want to call it, that aesthetic encounter. One is, compared to a laboratory, like laboratory participants, visitors to a museum are quite motivated. They went there for a reason. They paid whatever ticket, at least in the US, it could be $30 to get into a museum. You've commuted to the museum, you drove there, took the subway. Also, you're seeing genuine artworks, typically large in scale. The colors are really vibrant. There's texture if you walk up to, let's say, a painting, texture on the canvas's surface. Then you have the dedicated viewing space, right? The museum is there for a reason. The moment you walk in, everything has been thought of, like the whatever decoration, the design, the lighting, the way that the space is set out so that it flows well when you walk through the galleries. And then the last thing, it could be the most important actually, in terms of our experiences of art in a museum versus elsewhere. It's what I call the curatorial elements. And my colleagues and I have written a lot about this. And it's those things that the museum has done to contextualize that art viewing. So take any artwork in a museum. They didn't just kind of like pick one from the collection and put it on a wall, right? That's not the case. So what they've done is they've installed it, they've researched it. The curators have spent decades probably with, learning about, studying a particular style, a group of artists, something like abstract expressionists, West Village of New York, right? Very specific. So whenever we see a painting or any art in a museum, it is within a context, what we call the curatorial narrative. There's a story behind it. So an artwork is never just hung in isolation. There's always some connection that they make within that particular gallery. It could be, let's say, the artwork to the left inspired the one that you're looking at, which inspired the one to the right, and so forth, right? So the museum context is important. Over the years, I've done with many, dear colleagues, research at, the Whitney, the Metropolitan Art Institute, all those things. And right now, I mentioned to Guy and Elizabeth earlier, we're conducting simultaneous studies at this moment at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, at the Yale Center for British Art, and also the Montclair Art Museum. So over the years, we've realized that the reason we're drawn to doing research in museums is because all of those things that I talked about, genuine artworks, visitors that are being motivated, to come to the museum, they have expectations, the curatorial narrative. So in my opinion, it's easier to capture those profound, meaningful experiences in a museum context. Not saying that you can't capture anywhere else, but it is pretty optimized for that. And that's what we study, and that's what I'll talk about today. When asked to describe their experience in the museum, we get big things beyond liking, beyond preference. Things like this exhibition's powerful, right? Or it's somber, visitors come out and say, well, that was eye-opening, that was inspiring. Like I can't, and we ask them to describe it. Like, I can't describe it. It's inspiring. It was moving. I experienced the sublime, a bit rarer. That was a spiritual experience for me, or something transformative. So these big things we have not fully accounted for. We actually stay away from it as psychologists. We have for many years because they're really difficult to study. It's very difficult to create context, experimental context and situations to do these things, right? To study these things. So if we go back to those big, sort of powerful, profound, complex experiences, one thing that is really interesting is that our interactions with art. So we've studied how long people look at art, right? Some of you know this research by Smith and Smith. They did the original study in 2001 at the Met Museum. They observed how long people looked at masterpieces by Picasso, by Matisse, right, Raphael, and we did the similar study in 2017. I worked with Jeff and Lisa Smith at the Art Institute of Chicago, and we also did sort of replication of that initial study. Again, think of profound experiences, transformative, right, transcendental, spiritual experiences, looking at art. What we found was that these pieces that you look at in a museum, it was only about 27.2 seconds, right, on average. So if we think of that, roughly 30 seconds, all right, back to these masterpieces, standing in front of, some of these are big canvases, very complex pieces, but it's about 7.2 seconds. That's the mean. The mean was actually pulled up by a few outliers, I would say. The median time, and this is two different museums, right, is about 15 seconds. That's all it takes, right? So it's not individual artworks. So what we also know is that it's not, the claim is not 15 seconds will make you experience these profound things. Jeff Smith talked about the museum effect, right, as essentially the cumulative effects of many 15-second interactions within a museum setting. So by the time you walk out, you've felt this sort of thing that is the result of many little experiences within a 1 hour or 2 hour period. But still, I think it's really fascinating that the interactions generally are pretty short. By the way, this average, let's say roughly 30 seconds, includes the time people spent reading a label and taking a picture of the artwork. How crazy is that? How much we're able to achieve, right? But that's the human mind. So now here's the claim. I'm going to talk about, in addition to the cumulative effects of many different artworks, I proposed the mirror model of art in 2013 as a way to characterize the aesthetic experiences that basically lead us, as I argued it, lead us to these bigger, more personally meaningful engagement with art. All right, I'm going to run you through the model and then talk about a study or two that attempted to test the model. So let's begin with the art making process. I'm going to take painting as an example here. Most artists, most architects, most designers, product designers begin, and even fashion designers begin with sketches, right? They do many studies, could be days, weeks, even months of making sketches. Then again, taking painting as an example, typically the first step is to create an underdrawing on the canvas, on the blank canvas. And the underdrawing is basically to lay out some of the main structures, the main objects and all these things that are going to be depicted in this painting. Then there's what I call expansion and adaptation. This is when you build up material layers on the canvas and really work out the composition, really create, add the details, And as an artist, as you're actually building up these material layers, you're also building up conceptual layers because you're making changes, you're adapting the process depending on what's happening at the moment, right? Sort of like new realizations, maybe you change materials and so forth. Towards the end, now this is again a very simplified version of this. This was based on research that Ward, for example, has done on how artists create. Paul Locker did something similar, studied how artists create. Then the last part is finalizing, and this is typically when you have the materials have already been built up. Now you're working at the surface of the canvas. Varnishes, last bits of color, last bits of detail, working out certain contours. Let's say the nose part or the eyebrow in this particular example on the screen. So we go from initialization to finalizing, but going back to initialization, what's important there is that the artist didn't just start making stuff, right? Didn't just start studying, making sketches and doing the underdrawing. There was some motivation behind this work. Okay? There was some motivation behind the time that the artist put in. A lot of time, a lot of resources, and so a lot of thinking, a lot of materials, a lot of concepts that led up to the beginning that inspired that inspired the creation of the piece to begin with. All right? Then you go through the steps. The aesthetic experience goes backwards. And that's sort of where the mirror comes in. From cognitive psychology, we know that the first things we look at visually when we would process, let's say, this painting, are the color, the contour, right? Light and dark, sort of contrasts, symmetry. These are fairly mostly automatic processing that happens early in that stream, right? But we process the surface of the painting. If we give it a few seconds, then memory kicks in. Who is this person? The hand is interesting. I wonder if the artist what was the intention here, or like, this reminds me of someone. Then as you go on, if you give the process time, then we go, actually, as art perceivers, we go back to the beginning where the artist started. Why did the artist create this piece? I wonder what the historical context was regarding the creation of this piece, what inspired it, and so forth. So the mirror model of art characterizes that as basically like a mirror process, where if we give it time, the aesthetic experience, we actually we end our aesthetic engagement or aesthetic encounter. We end it where the artist actually began. All right. So the claim is that some of the more profound, some of the more complex, some of the more meaningful aesthetic experiences can be described when we actually give it time, right? The aesthetic encounter time for us to go back and start peeling those conceptual layers as we're looking at an artwork. So if you were interested in tests of the mirror model, there's several. I'll point out 2 neuro tests. Sakeli et al. Did a meta-analysis of 34 fMRI studies. Fens and Farr did the same 50 fMRI studies. They're basically tested the mirror model directly using neuroscientific works. And then Vartanyan et al. Just recently presented a study in Germany 2 weeks ago of Picasso paintings that also directly tested the claims of the mirror model. So I can send you the citations later on if you're interested. So now mirror, right? The mirror model in a way can be considered as like not just correspondences between the steps of art making and the steps of art viewing, but in a way, and this is really being provocative, but pardon me, all right, it's 9 a.m. here, so I can be provocative to get things going. It's a conversation, right? The mirror model describes a conversation between the artist and the viewer, with the artwork as the medium of that conversation. All right, the artwork is how that conversation flows through. So I'm going to talk about a study we did a while back at the old Whitney Museum before they moved to the High Line area of New York. And the the question was, and a kind of basic question, if a viewer looks at an artwork or an entire exhibition, are they able to sort of capture without being prompted some of the characteristics of that artwork, the sort of profile of that artwork or the exhibition? When we ask them, let's say, what emotion did you feel? Are they able to capture or to speak about the emotions that perhaps the artist talked about when they were creating an artwork or a particular emotional profile of an exhibition? So there are two exhibitions we're comparing, and we looked at the artwork level and the exhibition level. The painting to your left is by A. Bronson, and is a painting of his partner on his partner's deathbed, essentially dying of AIDS, right? And this exhibition contained this painting along with painting artworks from the Whitney's permanent collection. Quite formal works that are quite known. The feel of the exhibition was pretty somber, pretty serious, quite formal. The one to the right, I think it was a floor below the first exhibition that I described, is an exhibition of Corey Archangel works. I don't know if you're familiar. It's playful, video games, right? Interactive stuff, things that are moving, a lot of noise, very loud, like the least informal exhibition. It was actually exhausting to be in that room for an extended amount of time. I would often go back to the permanent collection exhibition just to kind of relax when we were collecting this data. So the question is, we looked at writings about specific artworks by art historians, and sort of we developed an emotion profile for each artwork that we looked at and the exhibitions as a whole. So, for example, the one on the left, the painting, you would expect that the artist was probably not feeling very positive when creating this piece, right? All the sort of emotional factors behind it, it's going to be very different than the artwork to the right, the video game of like bowling and all these things. So emotions are some of the hardest things to study. Really, it's if you ask somebody what emotion does this artwork make you feel, they're gonna give you a roughly 5, right? It makes me feel happy. It makes me feel sad. I'm confused or I'm interested. All these things, but not very nuanced. So we use what's called the Geneva Emotion Wheel, and the survey actually looks like this: is paper and pencil, and you kind of click on you check a circle, which emotion family, there's 20 that you're feeling at that moment after looking at an artwork or after exiting the exhibition. And then the farther you check out from the center, the more intense that emotion is. So we all to depict this data, we were doing eye tracking at the time. You've seen those eye tracking results with the heat maps. We did something very, very similar with this. So, for example, with the Corey Archangel playful, lighthearted exhibition and artworks, the yellower, the hotter. So, visitors to that exhibition, reported feeling, amusement, laughter, involvement, interest. So, you look at the hot spots: enjoyment, pleasure, wonderment, feeling awe, astonishment, surprised, and a bit of longing, nostalgia, right? So we know that from the writings, from the by the curators and the art historians and just the artists, Corey, this is pretty spot on as far as like what viewers experienced. And then with the A. Bronson, involvement, interest, enjoyment, pleasure, all right, which was surprising for us. But then if you look at some of the clusters on the left, bottom left, sadness, despair, pity, compassion, longing, and nostalgia. So side by side, we were able to show, and we had various artworks, all right? We were able to show, and this is within the exhibition, this is within specific artworks. On the left here is Georgia O'Keeffe's Ladder to the Moon. Georgia O'Keeffe specifically talked about nostalgia when speaking of this piece. We didn't prompt the visitors, all right? That also was not in the label, nostalgia. But if you were to ask without giving the emotion wheel, I would say there's very little chance that some visitor, all right, or 300 of them, all right, that was our end size, would have said, "Oh, this gives me a feeling of longing and nostalgia," right, when looking at the painting. It just doesn't happen, right, from my experience. The middle one, here's a sculpture hanging. It's a metal thing. It's absolutely crazy that something that heavy, it's supposedly super heavy, hangs, on that little beam. People were very sort of polarized about what they felt: involvement, interest, and wonderment, feeling awe. All right, and they compare that to at the individual artwork level, the A. Bronson piece, sadness, despair, pity, compassion. So is the argument then that there is a transfer of emotions from the artwork or the artist to the viewer? Not necessarily. I mean, one can argue maybe you can say it is a transfer, but within the framework of the mirror model, it's saying that there's some correspondence going on. There is some sort of match going on between what the artwork, what it's presenting to the viewer, and what the viewer is actually experiencing. All right. Matthew Pulaski did similar work, found similar results, but completely different methodology, completely different sample, obviously, and completely different artworks. But the idea of that mirroring, there is evidence, building evidence that that's happening. Okay, so that's, I wouldn't somewhat of a direct test of the mirror model, but we also wanted to find to figure out, like, to what extent do people would naturally think about the artist and that creative process, right? If we were just to ask them to stand in front of an artwork and talk about what they're thinking and what they're feeling. So that's what we did, actually, at the new Whitney Museum, by the way. I've had a long relationship with the Whitney Museum, so that's why we keep coming back there. With this study, we wanted to characterize perceivers' lived experiences of personally meaningful artworks in the museum. It's really a study of a phenomenological study, in the sense, and we used, we were really inspired by aesthetic cognitivism. All of you know this. You're working on the project, right? Similar project funded by Templeton. And it's the idea that experiences of art can enhance our understanding and our cognitive abilities. So it's a bit of a combination of being influenced by the mirror model and aesthetic cognitivism. We have a paper coming out on this soon. So this is the new Whitney. If you ever have a chance to visit, it's a fantastic space. What we wanted to do is recruit people as they walk in to the museum, have them walk around right after they said, yeah, I'll participate in a study, and then come back to us after 15, 20 minutes. And then we asked them, like, can you pick an artwork that resonated most with you, like, or that you found personally meaningful, one artwork. So, and then once they did, they took us to the artwork. We handed them a tape recorder. We stood sort of to the back, quite behind them, and said, we're going to use what's called a think aloud protocol. And all you need to do is talk about what you're thinking, feeling, and otherwise experiencing at this moment as you're standing in front of the artwork that you chose that you considered personally meaningful. For exhibitions, Edward Hopper's New York, it's like massive retrospective, an exhibition of Puerto Rican artists. The theme was, sort of post-Hurricane Maria. Another one that is connecting painting and sculpture, and then the permanent collection of the Whitney Museum. There's like 3 main floors that we were on during this time. It took about 4 months of data collection in and out. So what we wanted to do is I just gave you a hint there of the results. Not yet. First, how we got the results. Thematic content analysis, 100 participants. All the think alouds, again, were recorded, turned into transcripts, and then we did the formal coding, trying to extract the themes from the hundreds and hundreds of pages of transcripts from the think alouds. So again, imagine they're standing in front of a work that they thought was personally meaningful. These are our results, the 5 themes that we came up with. I'm not gonna, in interest of time, I might not be able to go through all of them. First is self and life history, all right, relating the work to themselves and their background. Second is others in the world, thinking about how the work relates to their thoughts of others and the world. Art techniques and materials, this idea of searching for meaning and creating an aesthetic narrative. That's fascinating. I'll talk about that a bit more. And then obviously, artists and the creative process we expected to see. Here's one with self and life history. And it's this artwork to the left. I think any piece of art tells you in part how the artist sees the world at that moment. I think what it tells you is something elemental about yourself or about other people. They see it this way, I see it differently. The more you look at it, the more things you see. Like, I see a rainbow in there now that I think originally I didn't see, because I've been looking at it for 5 minutes and I'm, oh, wait, where are all the other little things that I haven't seen? So I do definitely appreciate the ability to look at something for a prolonged period of time and see more. And I think humans are like that too, right? The more opportunity we have to connect with them, the more we see. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, both. This is a piece, actually I'm going to go back to that and have you look. This is a massive painting, actually panels. It's a 9-panel painting that occupied, from the bottom of on the ground up the way to near the ceiling. And it's about, how I would say, pretty tall. 3 meters tall, all right, in total. When I first passed by the work, my first reaction actually was that it made me really uncomfortable. And I wasn't sure what the intention was meant to be, the really kind of aggressive depiction of. It was really hard to tell even at first whether this was pleasure or pain. And I kind of walked around and just moved away from it at first because I wasn't sure whether I liked that feeling. And then as I was doing my second pass by, I was kind of just curious, why did that give me such a strong reaction? And I didn't really inspect it carefully to try and think through. So I read the blurb, the label, and I'm actually an OBGYN, or OB-GYN. I'm training to provide abortion care. And I don't see a lot of contents about getting abortions, providing abortions, really anything. And I think that was, for me, a really powerful example of how taking everything in context, the way that's presented, really opened up space for me to engage more with the art. And looking at it after that, reading the blurb, I feel like I was more comfortable to spend time in front of some of this really uncomfortable imagery and sort of feel more empathy and sort of also like hopelessness, but more in a human connected way as opposed to an alienating way. So these are pictures of abortions, essentially. And the story here was that the artist, and by the way, this was around the time when Roe versus Wade was roughly being overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. And the artists tried to get an abortion at some point in their life, and they couldn't because they were pregnant. So they couldn't because they had cancer. Of course, they were pregnant. You don't get an abortion if you're not pregnant, unless I guess there's situations. But they had cancer, so they had to balance their own life with that of the baby. Right, the baby was healthy at the end, I think. But they really had a hard time with trying to navigate that situation. And they depicted the sort of feelings that they had at that time through this painting. It's really incredible, actually, if you see it in person. Let's see. And this is a painting by Bailey. And if you kind of need to really look at this before we get to the quote. So I'm going to sort of point out 3 different areas. The middle is a plant, all right, a flower. The right image is a ship. Okay. First of all, and this is art techniques and materials. First of all, it looks like a blueprint, right? So it's technical, and I was drawn to it because I was aware, having been to the Smithsonian African American Museum, and I thought it was from a distance. I thought it was probably related to the slave ships. But then I noticed it was a cotton plant, and it looks almost clinical and technical in its approach. But then when you look closely at it, there's actually quite a bit of technique involved. I think it was pretty meticulous and intentional in its technical approach in that these android figures are repetitive, and I've looked at them closely. They're sort of beautifully simple in their construction, but the botanical picture of the cotton plant, which for being such like the turn of a page of a textbook, says so much more than a typical text would say to you, especially juxtaposed with the slave ship shapes of the bodies. All right, I'm going to do one more and then, because I think I'm over time. Let's do this one, Artist in the Creative Process. It was something about, and this painting is roughly like the size of a meter across. Pretty large size. It was something about it that feels just like looking out of a window and looking at a landscape. But it probably conveys their mood, I would assume, because I feel like every art kind of shows what the artist is thinking inadvertently and how they feel about life. I'd like to think that this artist feels like there's some magic and kind of creativity within the world that just is inherent, intangible, and they're just creating how they feel. All right. So what we found sort of throughout the across the think alouds was people wanted to relate the artwork to themselves. They talked a lot about the artistic techniques and materials, but there's a lot of empathy for the artist, right? Again, going back to the idea of the mirror model, they were really trying to get back to, I wonder why this piece was created. I wonder what the motivation was. I wonder what the artist was experiencing. And that's something that, although we didn't set out to show these different themes, these were emergent themes, right? But it spoke to a lot of the things that we were thinking about before we even ran the study. So this paper is under revision at the moment. So hoping that it does get accepted within the next month or two, and then I can share out with all of you, and then you can really read the results and the methods that we used. So I'm going to skip this. That's it. Thank you for this. This obviously was funded by Templeton Religion Trust, and I just want to thank everyone for listening.
Thanks very much, Pablo. We've got more than 20 minutes for discussion and question. Awesome. So I can see a lot of hands clapping, but now we need raised hands for questions. Davide.
Thank you. I'm interested in the first part of your talk, and in particular, I'm curious to know if your model could be, in a sense, influenced in a negative or positive way by the role of, for instance, we can mention the curatorial approaches on the one hand, and the display organization of the museum. Why? Because they, as we know, and as you have said during your talk, they are relevant in order to establish different degrees of, let me say, possible experiences and possible modification of them. But I would like just to have an idea if this could be accepted by you as an interference or something that could be measured by different tools or whatever. So I'm interested in this.
Yeah, I think definitely the sort of curatorial context can impact. What it can do is direct your attention to very specific aspects of that creative process, right? From like the underdrawing, why the artist made this, all the different stuff to the end where surface, features, colors, all those things. Any label, any sort of information can direct your attention to very specific things. So then your experience now is biased towards that one area or one way of thinking or one set of information. One thing about the mirror model is that I'm not claiming that you're going to be correct, right? So for example, the claim is not that you're definitely going to extract what the artist was feeling, thinking, otherwise experiencing, and that's what you're gonna feel in the aesthetic experience. You might be wrong. The viewer might be completely wrong and not even be anywhere near what was intended. It's just a more of a description of what is possible. But I think generally, you're more, I guess, you're more likely to get closer to what the artist intended, felt, etc., than you're not. If does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it is interesting, really interesting, because we have a lot of occasions in which the possible narratives which are produced by the viewers, giving not, we cannot say that they are correct or not,
Right.
but we can
Right.
say that they are directed in a way or another by the two
Yes.
elements I mentioned. So this is really interesting because this is a way according to which we can consider the role of a sort of a context dependence in a
Right.
way for them and for the experience. And so this is really interesting. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Good, thank you. Guy.
Thanks so much, Pablo. It's really interesting. You covered loads of ground, and I didn't at all feel like you went over the time. In fact, it felt like it was lots more to say. It's really exciting. Just one quick clarification, and that is that the claim about the mirror model, and I know this goes back a while. It, so the second half, the kind of coming back, which you characterize in terms of aesthetic experience, and there was this kind of like the first stage is the automatic processing, and then there's the adding in detail, accessing memory, and then there's more kind of like a concerted effort to say, well, okay, it means this. That that is brilliant, but also that does seem to be straightforwardly like how one would capture kind of like visual experience more generally if there's a stage of trying to work out what something is. Just for clarification, so the claim is not that that captures like exclusively aesthetic experience, but the claim is more like it's a mirror model, so that it basically mirrors the creative process.
Right. The claim, the aesthetic side of it, right? The bottom part of the that stream, that's really inspired by in the paper. I draw a lot from Helmut Leder's model, 2004 model, and John Chatterjee's 2004, I think 2003 model. Paul Locker in product design did something similar. And in Stefan Kolsch music has a very similar description of music processing, which is you go from the sort of like surface level to the deeper meaning making. So that's really nothing new. What the mirror model claims is really, yes, it's that correspondence with it's the first, I think, the first time that the art making process has been linked directly to the art viewing process, right? And that's sort of the new thing with the mirror model when it was first proposed. So it's really those correspondences that is the focus, sort of like that integration, that matchup, that is the main aspect of the claim of the mirror model.
Terrific, terrific. Good. Just to clarify, and then I actually had a question about this really interesting point about you used the Geneva motion wheel, and you made this point about it's really difficult to track these things because if you ask people like flat out what they were feeling, you'd be restricted to kind of like three or four,
Yes.
possibly five. And it just struck me it's such a kind of like a minefield for anybody like thinking about this kind of research because like the moment you like stick out a map of like how emotions relate to each other, which ones are more or less the same, you're giving the subject so much that they can then like look back into their own experience and kind of understand their own experience in that way. And I just wondered if there's some kind of like meta psychology or empirical work looking at the problematics of this and what it tells us about what what it means to have an emotion, how much of our experience of emotion is ourselves trying to make sense of a certain complex of feelings and the fact that that effort, which you could also possibly you have a certain feeling contour, then you try and like think about the details, and then you do have this kind of like a a little bit like your character's aesthetic experience. You have this kind of multi-stage until you finally
Right.
decide, oh, what I'm feeling now, it's pity, and
Yeah.
it takes everybody a while to get, and yeah. So is there like work saying, so what does this actually tell us about what emotions are?
Absolutely. Yeah, I love the minefield word. It is a minefield. Emotions is, it's really, it took us a while too to kind of get into the mode of should we study this? Because it's in every writing. If you look at art historical writing, art critics, emotions always pop up. But again, as psychologists, as scientists, like I'm always wary as like, what can we actually learn? Can we actually do this? And we did, but even then, you raise a good point. Um, you could critique the idea that, well, we were actually priming people too much. Maybe that's not what they felt. Maybe they couldn't. They felt something that wasn't really even categorizable, right? Able to be categorized into one of those 20 different emotions. Maybe that, and that would be a good argument against it, and saying that, well, you artificially kind of placed too much attention. You made them choose when they probably could not choose naturally. So in a way, we did probably inflate that to an extent, right? But as scientists, we go with sample size. We had 300 people, so we can put the noise towards like the error terms, in terms of doing statistical analyses. But yeah, it's really hard. But there is research. There's vast scholarship on emotions, much more so than I can speak of. The Geneva Emotion Wheel comes from Scherer's group. Something to look at, by the way, if you're interested in studying emotions. The Geneva Emotion Wheel is backed by a very, very strong theoretical foundation, right? And if you look at the website with the emotion wheel, the wheel itself has actually evolved over the years too, based on the research that Scherer has done, and people also outside that research group. So it is in a way a minefield, but I think over the years, psychologists have become quite much better at it, and I think they're better at it because they're more humble, right? I think as soon as we study these complex things like aesthetic experience, emotion, all these things, if one loses intellectual humility, then you step on that mine, right? But if you keep humble at it and question and second guess and assume that you're wrong. I assume that I'm wrong every given moment, every step of, I'm going into 3 new studies at this moment, data collection. I'm assuming that we're getting things wrong, right? And my students are absolutely going nuts. They're like, there's nothing wrong. We've thought of everything. I'm like, no, you didn't. We did not think of it, because watch, first day, something's going to happen. So I think intellectual humility is, when tackling such complex phenomena, is really, really important.
Great, thank you so much.
I think that's a point which really resonates with us right now, working on the questionnaires.
Oh yeah.
Thank
Oof.
you. Iris.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for your talk. It was really amazing. I had some problems with my internet, so I missed part of it. I'm sorry if my question then goes in the
Oh,
completely
that's okay.
weird. But anyway, I have 2 small questions, and the first one is inspired by Malcolm Turvey's. I don't know if you're familiar with. He's a film scholar, and he has just published this amazing book about the ways in which philosophical theories and natural scientific theories interact with respect to understanding our artistic practices. So the first question is kind of inspired by Malcolm, who would say, this is all very nice and well, congratulations, but what exactly should we as philosophers, or as someone interested in understanding art and art's value, and let's say the kind of norms governing our practices, what would be the impact of your research on that? Is this something that you are trying to accomplish, to kind of contribute to these sorts of debates? Or do you really see your project as only concerned with the kind of cognitive part of what's happening in the audience when they are approaching the work? And with respect to that, this is now my question, no Malcolm here. Do you consider cases where there are discrepancies between the the ways in which different audiences members react to one and the same painting. And I'm asking this from my own, if I may, perspective. I'm working on film and then the way in which film, let's say, educates our moral emotions. And one of the examples that keeps coming up is that whether it is respect to the gender, so male versus females, or whether it is even with respect to races, so whites versus blacks, they tend to have quite different reactions to the same scene. And for example, Thelma and Louise example is telling in that sense that for many male audiences, they fail to register the emotional impact of the rape, of the possible rape. Whereas for the women, it really was an intense emotional kind of horror. And, so I was just wondering whether you come across these kind of discrepancies. And if you do, what would be the impact of those cases which go not only against the artist himself or herself, but also within the different members of the audience? How would you conceptualize on that?
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah, let me start with the second question. I think there's different levels of looking at this. So, for example, if we look at the way that I'm going to go back to visual arts, right? Paintings as an example. I think we have quite a bit in common as far as the initial reactions, the sort of initial processing, the low level visual features, or even in music, low level features in music. We tend to process, for example, symmetry, similarly, complexity, contour, color, lightness versus darkness, sort of contrast. But when our memory kicks in, right, then you start to see some divergence in experiences. Then the longer we actually interact with a stimulus, the more possibility that we're going to have quite different reactions to that particular stimulus. So in a way, the beginning of that process, sort of the low level visual features, our brains are more similar than they are different, right? But our life experiences are quite different in many situations for many people. So yes, I think the beauty of art and studying it for me is like capturing both the similarities and the differences, and more importantly, trying to explain what's causing that. So the example that you gave of a rape scene, and the sort of emotional reactions between males and females, that does make sense given what people think about when they go into, let's say, a dangerous situation, walking in the back alley, right? So my experience might be different from yours, at least my expectation of what could potentially happen in that situation. And as a psychologist, to really be open to these differences and also similarities, right? That's important because we should be able to capture sort of the full spectrum. So that's your second question. Going back to your first question, the answer is, I guess, yes and yes, or yes and no, depending on how I look at it. Yes, we are interested in basic research. We want to know what happens cognitively. We want to be able to better explain what's driving, what are the mechanisms, psychological, cognitive mechanisms that's driving our reactions when we walk into a museum. But at the same time, so I've worked with museums and in museums for, I'm going to date myself here, over 20 years, right, doing research in museums. I kind of like to think that the work that I do, the work that we do, my colleagues and I have an impact. And we have done, every time we do research in a museum, I shouldn't say every time, but most of the time, once we have the results analyzed and all these things, we present back to the museum. And often they say, oh, that really informs our strategic plan for this year. Oh, that makes sense. That really informs what we're going to do on Saturdays when the families come for a certain family program, right? Or school programs after school during the weekdays. So it's yes, that we care about the cognitive mechanisms and sort of the nitty gritty of psychology, but we also think that we'd like to make an impact and make a difference. And how they use it, I'm not one to say how the museum will use it, but I like to think that I like the idea that they're considering using some of this stuff in their own practice. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question, but I did see
Yeah.
some hands go up and down earlier. I don't know if John, I think your hand was up. Did you want to perhaps? Oh,
Some technical problems too. I'll make this really, really quick. So your project's an example of aesthetic cognitivism because the mirror theory foregrounds a kind of sense-making process that we're engaged in when we're viewing a work of art, right? In philosophy, when we talk about aesthetic cognitivism, we're also interested in the ways in which that might lead to kinds of cognitive improvement or epistemic benefits. And so I noticed you use language like transformation. The experiences of art can be transformative or transcendental. Could you say a little bit about that, a little bit more about that, and how that might help us think about some of the psychological benefits of engaging in these kinds of experience?
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you.
it goes, yeah, thank you. I think it goes beyond just the mirror model. It goes back to the museum effect. But my colleague, Jeff Smith, proposed that in 2014. Right around, there's a lot of things going on at that moment in the field in terms of like making the switch from the big, we're studying preferences to some, let's study bigger things and bigger reactions. And Jeff Smith's idea of museum effect is that cumulative aspect. I don't think one artwork and one experience can transform you, right? I think several things have to happen. Um, I'm just numbering this to make sense in my own head. One, that you have to have deep engagement, right? And I think that's where the mirror model comes in. If we can sort of promote that approach, that mindset, um, with during our encounters, that increases the probability of bigger things happening, like transformation or meaning making and so forth. But that's not in itself going to be powerful enough. Second, I think you have to have many different experiences, right, throughout time. And time is important because if you're engaged with art, let's say you're in the museum for 20 minutes versus you're in the museum for 4 hours, a lot of things happen in those 4 hours, where I think it opens yourself up to experiences that and ways of thinking that otherwise you wouldn't be open to. I'm not saying it's like meditation or whatever, but it's very similar to meditation. You open yourself up to your surroundings and your environment and things that you typically won't notice. You start noticing them because again, it slows you down. This, aesthetic education and historically that's been the focus, right? To open you up to your surroundings. So you need that ability to really have deeper engagement. You have to have the treatment, as we call it in psychology, has to be strong enough, I mean longer and more, right, in order for that to happen. So then, and also the measurement aspect of it, like one has to create a measure that can tap into that process. Otherwise, we're kind of just guessing whether it's happening or not, right? And it's never one measure. It has to be a triangulation sort of process, to figure out whether some transformation is happening, whether meaning making is happening. Is there an increase in understanding, right? Sort of educational learning aspect of an aesthetic encounter. Great question, John.
thank you. I'm just going to insert myself here. We have
Yeah.
about 30 seconds left, but it's okay. And because it kind of follows on from this. And I mean, I think the mirror model sounds, we can learn a lot from it. But one of the things that I at first thought was a little surprising was in the lower level, the way the arrows were going in a very, it was first we do this, then we go do this, and then we do this third thing, right? Into kind of from the finalization to the initialization and so on. And that seems to me that, of course, there's a lot of toing and froing going on there. You might jump
Yeah.
from the first to the third and then back to the first and to the second. And, there's a lot of,
Yes.
which of course chimes with the idea of conversation that you were talking about. But I also thought, in connection with that, some of you showed us 3 artworks, so I understand it's a small sample, but the thing that most people seem to report on was this idea of involvement and interest in all cases that you showed us from the Whitney, right?
Yes.
And I wondered if there's a possible link there with the fact that we're involved and we keep that interest going. Does that support the idea that the mirror model is helpful and good, but there's a lot of there's a lot of jumping around going on also.
Right, there's a lot of jumping around. I wouldn't
Yeah.
say necessarily it's helpful and good. It's just descriptive, right?
Right.
And it really, it doesn't argue that you're following that trajectory. That it's not quite as linear as it seems.
Sure.
But even the creative process is not as linear as it seems.
Right.
So,
Right.
you get to there, you can actually go back, paint over a certain area of the canvas. If you're like Picasso, paint over the entire canvas, right? Start a new piece. But generally, on average, that is typically, if you really oversimplify the process, you do have those steps. But yeah, you can go back, and from the aesthetic experience, you can say, okay, you're talking about the artist now. Then you go back to looking at details in the painting and say, actually, yeah, that I didn't notice that at first, right? If you go,
Yeah.
that one quote that I didn't notice that at first, but the more I looked at it, that seemed to pop up. And then you go now back down to,
Mm.
yeah, what was the artist thinking here?
Mm.
So yes, there's a lot of jumping back and forth.
And
And I
that
think that's
can, yeah. Sorry, go
that's the
ahead.
challenge. The challenge of doing this is that it's definitely not a linear
And we can do that as
process.
long as we're involved and interested, right? And that's,
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Going back to the involvement and interest, because it's
yeah.
all about, I talked about the strength of treatment, time, right? That is important. You have to give them ample time to engage with a
Mm.
piece in order, for something to work, for something to happen.
Mm.
Because 27.2 seconds is one artwork, right? But we need many, many 27.2 seconds,
Yeah.
I think, for the effects of it, negative or positive, because you could leave the museum hating yourself, right? Because somehow an artwork's triggered something in you.
Mm.
Is that a successful interaction? Probably yes, because it changed you if we look at change, right? But it's not necessarily happy and positive.
Mm.
So
Mm.
it's all levels and all sort of different valences of
Yeah.
experiences.
Well, thank you so much, Pablo, for answering that question so well and all our questions. It's now past 4 o'clock, so we should round off the session. Let's thank Pablo again for a great
Thank
talk.
you all. Yeah, this is
Question.
fantastic. This was fun.
Good. Join us again, please,
I
and
will.
everybody else, of course, too.
Yes,
Thank
sounds
you.
good. Thank you.
Thanks for today.
All
Bye.
right, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye
very
bye.
much.
Thank you for listening to this recorded seminar from the research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. To find out more about the project, please go to our website www.aestheticcognitivism.com.